In today's macro analysis, we will analyze the relationship between foreign holdings of US Treasuries and the US dollar index. What is my theory behind this relationship? I believe that there should be a negative correlation between foreign holdings of US Treasuries and the US dollar index. Because as the US dollar index becomes stronger, foreign countries may want to, or foreign holders of US Treasuries may want to sell the US Treasuries that they hold in order to have more dollars that they can then use to support their local or domestic currencies. And when you take a look at the right-hand side of the screen, the blue line represents foreign holdings of US Treasuries. The red line represents the US dollar index. It already looks like there is a negative relationship there. So in today's analysis, we will use statistical tools to assess whether there is a negative correlation and whether this correlation is statistically significant. And we will then use this relationship to make a forecast essentially for 2025 and assess what the implications of a continued rise or strengthening of the dollar truly are. So the first thing we will do when you take a look at the left-hand side of the screen, which is the RStudio environment, we will rename the data set, which contains the data of this chart on the right-hand side. And then we will create a scatter plot. And on this scatter plot, we will add to this scatter plot, we will add a linear regression line. Beautiful. And the chart, you can see the chart on the right-hand side of the screen here. And this chart already tells you that there could be a negative correlation, which means that as the nominal broad US dollar index increases, signaling a stronger dollar, foreign holdings of US Treasuries tend to decrease. Now, the question is this relationship statistically significant? In order to assess this, we will create a linear regression model within the RStudio environment using this formula. And we will then summarize the model and take a look at the output. And over here, you can see the output of the linear regression model. We can already see that the US dollar index, that is our explanatory variable, foreign holdings of US Treasuries is our dependent variable. We can already see that there's a negative relationship here indicated by the negative coefficient. And this relationship is statistically significant with a t-value of negative 9.3. So this tells us that there is indeed a negative relationship between those two variables, which may support my theory that as the dollar becomes stronger, foreign holders of US Treasuries may want to sell their Treasury holdings in order to have more dollars and support their local currencies against the strengthening of the dollar. Now, what are the implications of this analysis? What does it mean? What is the so what behind this analysis? Well, in order to answer that, we need to take a look at the relationship between the 10-year Treasury yield and the US dollar index. As you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, from 2021 to 2024, there has been a positive relationship, which seems relatively strong, between the US dollar index and the 10-year Treasury yield. Let's take a look at whether this relationship is indeed statistically significant within the RStudio environment. First of all, again, we will rename the data set. And then we will create, once again, a scatter plot with a linear regression line. And you can beautifully see here that there seems to be a strong positive relationship between the US dollar index and the 10-year yield. As the 10-year yield, as the US dollar becomes stronger, the 10-year yield tends to increase. But I think that you should interpret this relationship the other way around. As the 10-year yield increases, the dollar tends to become stronger. Hence, technically in this analysis, the 10-year yield should be our explanatory variable and the US dollar our dependent variable. So let's just make that change right now and use a linear regression model to assess whether this relationship is statistically significant. We will create the model. We will look at the summary. Over here, you can see the regression output. What this regression output tells us is that there's a positive relationship between the 10-year yield and the US dollar. As the 10-year Treasury yield increases, the dollar tends to strengthen. We have a very high R squared using only that one explanatory variable to understand to explain variations in the US dollar. The R squared is around 78%, which means we're explaining 78% of the variation in the US dollar index using the 10-year Treasury yield. So let's combine all of these findings. What does this mean? The continued resilience of the economy, worries about the budget deficit, economic policy uncertainty, the Treasury under Scott Bessent likely issuing more longer-term bonds compared to Janet Yellen, who was more focused on the short term of the yield curve. All of these factors are causing the 10-year yield to rise. Now, a rising 10-year yield leads to a stronger dollar. This stronger dollar may lead to a reduction in foreign holdings of US Treasuries, and that leads to an even greater rise in the 10-year Treasury yield. So the big risk here is if the resilience of the US economy continues, the estimate of the neutral rate of interest continues to rise, then at the end of the day, that continued rise in the 10-year Treasury yield is then associated with a stronger dollar, and that ultimately leads to those foreign holders to sell treasuries, which will make it even harder to issue all that debt from the budget deficit, putting even more upward pressure on the 10-year Treasury yield. That is the risk that we're facing here, and it's certainly something to keep an eye on in the next few months. We need to keep an eye on how these foreign holdings of US Treasuries develop, and of course, how US Treasury yields develop. Have a great start to the new week.